The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMZ.
Hi, everybody. Again, it's a Humanity First time again. I'm Peter Evers, your host. And this week, we're going to be talking about something extraordinarily topical that people in Massachusetts know an awful lot about. In fact, it's probably one of those things that most people in Massachusetts know about, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But we have a great guest on today. We have Walter Kernow. Walter, hi. How are you?
Good, Peter. How are you doing?
Good. Walter is our VP of Facilities here at BAMZ and somebody who has their finger on the pulse of many things. But most importantly for us is what is going on in the housing market. How do we manage our houses? As people know from this show, we have about 90 or so residential homes where we care for people, no more than 5 people in a home 24/7 with developmental disabilities and mental illness. And that takes a big toll on many of the properties that we have, Walter. Tell us a little bit about your facilities department, because they are an amazing group of guys.
So we're located out of Brockton and Oak Hill Way, and from there we manage about 130 properties that BAMZ either owns or leases or rents, and there's a number of them that we do own. It ranges from out in the Worcester area all the way down to Lakeville, Carver, Middleborough, residential homes that you drive by and you might not even think are a group home, to commercial sites. So we have about 5 guys working for us.
Wait a minute. Can I just ask a question?
Yep.
You have 5 guys at 130 different properties.
Right. I'm working on that. I'm working with the CFO to increase the number of people working for the facilities department. But, you know, I've mentioned it before. We experience the same problems that a lot of people experience as far as getting people to work and getting good candidates. So, you know, it goes up and down. At one point we had about 7, and now we're down a couple, and we're working to increase that.
Yeah. Well, if I could just say that I think the work that you and those folks do is absolutely incredible. Some of the highest ratings in our organization for departments is definitely our facilities department, and we really appreciate everything that is done from responding to plumbing issues in the middle of the night to purchasing properties, and right. We do a lot of that. And one of the things I think that worries everybody at the moment is property prices, especially in Brockton, because Brockton's been seen for so long as a gateway community. But right. We just bought a house recently, right? And I think we paid a pretty penny for that.
Yeah, you're definitely seeing Brockton experience the pricing increases that other parts of the state have done over the years. Some people would say that Brockton is the next in line to be gentrified. They have a lot of access to public transport. There's a lot of state benefits and tax incentives to build around public transport. And I think people, instead of living in Quincy and Randolph and Boston, are now moving further southeast. And so I think Brockton's the next one in line. The prices really haven't gone down at all anywhere. You would think that they would, with interest rates right. being high. Right. But there really is kind of a lack of product out there. And that's what's really, I think, artificially keeping the prices up there. There's a lot of demand.
Yeah, I know from a personal point of view, with having kids who are in that sort of range of buying houses, it's really, really difficult. And I have counseled a couple of my kids not to buy at the top of the market when they're looking at houses in Carver that are $450,000, right. And they're probably a teardown, in terms right. of redevelopment. It's very difficult for new Americans, very difficult for new families, and is I think in a way a little bit of a pointer to the problems we're going to have in the future if it is difficult to buy a house in and around Brockton, which is one of those communities which is multicultural, diverse, gives opportunities for new Americans. And so I think we need to be paying attention to that in terms of how we more equitably sort of balance the needs of all population in this state.
Right.
Yeah. Speaking of state,
Yep.
And for those who don't know Walter, he has a very long history of also working in human services, working for Department of Youth Services for many years, and a number of other jobs in that regard, right, Walter?
Correct. Yeah, I worked for the Department of Youth Services for about 20 years, Department of Social Services, which is children and families, for about 10 or so. And I came to BAMSI in 2015.
Yeah, and Walter also has other skills, and I think I've shared this before with you, Walter, that when people do icebreakers and they say, "Tell me something interesting about yourself," I think once I had the misfortune of sitting next to somebody who said, "I once wrestled a bear."
Right.
And, do better than that, right? I think mine was I haven't thrown up for 35 years, which is pretty much the only interesting thing about me. But one of the interesting things about Walter is you might be watching a movie someday and there is Walter. Walter, give us a synopsis of a couple of movies that you've been in.
Yeah, I thought you were going to bring up the fact that I once had 2 goats because I used that as a icebreaker.
Did you wrestle them?
I did not. Yeah, I've been a member of Screen Actors Guild, I want to say probably since 2007. I just happened to see a casting call for Shutter Island, and at a whim, I just kind of went there. And I guess I look like an orderly from the 1950s because they cast me at that, and I was able to join the union. So since then, probably 25, 30 movies, just as a background performer. And so it was definitely a fun part-time job, so to speak. I usually get some good food and get to see some pretty remarkable actors do some of their work, and some not so good actors and not so good movies. But it's usually just a fun thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I get it's in some ways it's an inside scoop into, how people go, "Oh, such and such is such a nice person." We have no idea whether they're a nice person or not, right? And oftentimes behind the scenes we find out that probably their sort of public persona isn't quite what they are personally. And I would imagine you've seen a lot of that. And I'm not going to ask you, by the way.
I will say Adam Sandler is who you think Adam Sandler is, a down-to-earth guy and very nice, not pretentious at all, and will talk to anybody.
Yeah.
And Tony Orlando, if you can believe it, and Vanilla Ice. Those are 2 good.
Oh, Tony Orlando.
He's still around. Yeah.
Is he really?
Yeah.
Is that Ty Yellow Ribbon?
Yep.
Yeah. That's right. I remember him. He's still around. Amazing. But when we were chatting the other day, at the beginning of the week, while we were waiting for a couple of people to come in, our thoughts turned to something that a lot of people are interested in Massachusetts at the moment. That's the Karen Read trial. And you've been following this very closely, as everybody else has been. And I thought it would be a good idea to sort of talk a little bit about it. Now, just so that people know, we're not really talking about the verdict because as we're taping this, we don't know. I think we're in day 3 of deliberations.
Right.
What interests me about this case, and Walter, you have a lot of knowledge about it, is about how things happen. How do we end up with a situation that is so dire in this particular circumstances? What are the things that lead to behavior that results in the death of a human being? And then we have really witnessed a power struggle in many ways in a small town in Massachusetts that might look like any other town in the rest of this country. And the intrigue really is about the power and the authority of a police force and how sometimes that goes awry, and some of the choices maybe that some people make around how they use that authority and how the course of justice can be bent, if not broken sometimes. And this case has everything. So I'll begin by saying, as a nation, we get interested in certain things, and sometimes you sort of cock your head like a quizzical dog and say, why did this case become so interesting? Why do you think?
Right. Well, I think it's kind of just a modern day whodunit. There's obviously a tragic event occurred. There's salacious subplots. There's allegations of cover up and corruption, and in one case dirty cops, and then on the other there's allegations of hell has no fury as a woman scorned. It really is got a little bit of everything that probably interests people, and it really has resulted in people picking sides. And I think that's probably one of the bigger issues, not only in this case, but probably in America as a whole. You pick a side, you dig your heels in, and that's it.
Yeah.
So that's why.
I think there's something also about this sort of undermining of some of our cherished beliefs as well. Right. Certainly when I grew up in England, there was a phrase, if you want to know the time, ask a policeman. My right. parents used to tell me, if you're lost, look for a policeman. And English police have very special hats that are easily recognized right. if you want to Google that. But I had utter faith that I would be safe if I wandered into the path of a police officer. Not quite so anymore.
Right.
And some of it's deserved and some of it isn't.
Right.
We've seen so many things in front of our screens, like George Floyd's murder, that kind of thing. And yet we all know that there are really wonderful, dedicated police in our communities, many of whom are questioning whether they want to be in the police force anymore because of the public persona. This didn't really help the police, did it, in terms of how they look to outside society?
No, I think that's one of the bigger issues here when you're talking about the people involved in the tragic events of January 28th and 29th of 2022. Many of them were law enforcement officers. One was a federal law enforcement officer. Another, the victim was a Boston police officer, and there's a witness that's a Boston police officer and their family members. And I have to tell you, the one thing that's kind of come up throughout watching this is like, this was totally avoidable. Mm-hmm. This was some bad behavior by a lot of different people for an extended period of time. And you had mentioned about kind of just, bending the rules a little bit. And there seemed to be a lot of bending of the rules that night. There seemed to be a lot of drinking, excessive drinking in some cases, drinking and driving in some cases. And everybody seemed to own a little piece of it. And eventually it led to something tragic. It just makes it a lot worse when you see rules being broken and it's somebody who's supposed to uphold those rules. And then clearly the biggest example is the lead investigator who some of the things that he has said and done, are just absolutely abhorrent. And he, clearly, did not expect that his behavior would have a light shined on it, which makes it even more concerning because really the definition of integrity is doing the right thing, even when people aren't looking.
Yeah, that's right. And I think people were pretty horrified when they heard some of the things in the texts and the messages relative to his description of Karen Read. And it got a little tired, didn't it? When every time he would say, yes, I understand that this is not acceptable behavior under any circumstances. And yet there it was. And to your point, that sort of fitted in with this sense of entitlement that this group have. Just go back to that piece around alcohol. I wrote a really interesting article in The Atlantic this week, actually, called America Has a Problem with Alcohol. And it was an interesting take on it because it said America's always had a problem with alcohol. Society has a problem with alcohol. It isn't just America. But there's a reckoning coming that people are beginning to realize that a massive proportion of crimes that are committed, of violence that is committed, of violence against women that is committed, involves alcohol. In some ways, in this sense, it exacerbates that feeling of entitlement that group already have. And you had said to me, that they were going from pub to pub, bringing their own alcohol in, sort of creating this wall around themselves. In fact, the defending prosecutors said something interesting, said that they didn't build a thin blue line, they built a big blue wall that Karen Read couldn't get over. And that's all part of it, isn't it? It's that we are going to look after each other regardless of what morally we're responsible for. Again, I'm not saying that is true of every cop, but in this circumstance, it is we're living by different rules and we're holding other people accountable differently, right?
Yeah, I mean, when I look back, I don't know why it kind of struck me so specifically about the people taking drinks out of bars while they're going into the next bar. And again, these are police officers. These are family members of police officers. So they know that that's something that's not allowed. And not to mention the place that put the servers in some of these restaurants is concerning. They're certainly trained by the state and have requirements that they have to follow of cutting people off. But I believe one person had, 9 drinks in a couple hours, and they weren't cut off. And why was that? Because they were maybe with police officers. Another person had multiple drinks, had been drinking since 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And after 12 o'clock, went to work, which was a law enforcement place. So it's things like that I think really stick with people, because the rules are for everybody to follow,
right.
And for the most part, these are supposed to be upstanding members of the community, leading a good example. And through this whole process and this whole trial, it really shined a light on that. Maybe that's not the case all the time.
Yeah, and I think as a culture, we do like to see the mighty fall as well, right? I always think about that in sports. We build people up in order to bring them down again. We have certain expectations of law enforcement, and when it's right there in front of you, you begin to see this. And also, you begin to see a little, the beginning of maybe a cover-up, the beginning of, look what's happened. Now, again, we haven't had a verdict. We don't know what happened. But there's some evidence that's pretty strong that something happened that this group of people needed to cover up. For instance, everybody getting a new phone, the next week. The dog, discipline for those people who don't know anything about this. There were injuries that I think occurred in the house before, including, I think, a bite mark on the and yet all of those things were sort of covered up. And we have a vulnerable woman in the middle of this, who also has her own issues, obviously, with alcohol. And yet she seems to be isolated. She seems to be moved into this role as a convenient culprit, if you like. And we watched this in the trial, and we're really surprised because it is so evident. Another reason I think why everybody is so fascinated in this.
Yeah, I think the aspect of when it comes to Karen Read is the dehumanization of her by the other side. And again, like I said, there's 2 sides, right? There's one side that supporting Karen Read and out there in front of the courthouse and saying that there's an injustice here. And the other side, the anti-Karen Read, making personal attacks, making it very nasty. And it's all in order to dehumanize somebody. And regardless of how this ends up, I think it's an example of people losing sight of their humanity. That there should be some empathy for the majority of the people involved here. And I think it's been completely lost. And like I mentioned a couple of days ago, it's a complete microcosm, I think, of where we are as a culture as a whole. You're either with me or against me, and that's it.
Right. Yeah. And we are in our own echo chambers. And the more we read that is slanted one way or the other, the more we believe that. And that's where we get. Do you think Karen Read's had a fair shake here?
Well, I mean, you're just asking a guy that works for facilities. But it's kind of funny. I remember this happening on January 29th, or at least I remember the news of 2022. And I was like, wow, that's a crazy story. That's horrible. And then I completely forgot about it. And then about, 10 months ago, you start seeing the court case kind of progress a little more and more and more. And I got to tell you, the defense put up a pretty solid argument that there was at least the appearance of some injustice here. And bias, and kind of identifying the person that kind of fit the narrative that they created. So I thought one thing, January 29th, 2022, when the trial started, I thought something else. And by the end of the trial, before the verdict, I was in a completely different place. And I talked to my wife and my kids about it, and we all kind of went through that same process and still ended up thinking something different at the end.
There is so much to unpack, and I think that's really, I think you sort of put your finger on it before. It is a microcosm of what goes on around us. We pick sides. We're tribal. We're tribal, and police are tribal, and in some ways they have to be, because they're in incredibly difficult jobs where they have to look after each other. There is so much evidence that addiction is rife in the police community. I actually used to work for a while providing psychiatric services to Boston cops who had trauma, and they obviously do have trauma and obviously self-medicate sometimes more than anybody else because they're under that kind of stress. But we get a little window into what happens when people abuse their power, when people are drinking excessively, lose their impulse control, and act in a way that they wouldn't under normal circumstances. And part of that, I think, is we all have been there. We all know what that's like. There aren't many people who can sort of cast the first stone in that sense. And in that way, it's an alter ego, isn't it, issue in our society of saying, oh yeah, they're before the grace. And that is what this kind of behavior is manifests in the end, which I think is the message here, right? That as the Atlantic talks about, we have a reckoning with how we drink alcohol as a nation, how we advertise alcohol. I worried about my kids growing up because the only thing you saw on television with young people having fun was with alcohol. They seem inseparable. We need to work on that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I had mentioned that's one of the things that kind of stuck with me, and I certainly don't want to sound like you had mentioned that I haven't made bad decisions when I was younger, but when you're looking at middle-aged people at some point behaving in this manner, they have to kind of understand that there's consequences to your actions. And I always remember when I was younger, somebody used to tell me nothing good ever happens after 10 p.m. and I didn't believe them. But at some point you have to realize that in your life, and the excessive drinking always results in something bad happening. And you're right. I mean, I think the two type of commercials you see on TV right now are either some sort of liquor or beer and then pharmaceutical.
Yeah, that's right.
And it is sending the message that this is what you need in order to have a good life and to be happy, and it's really not the case at all.
It absolutely isn't. And hopefully there are things that we can learn from this case other than the sensational nature of what we've seen over the past few weeks. And again, we're not talking about the verdict today. We're talking about how we got here. Walter, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that as a person on the street like me. But it's a good thing to get, I think, beneath some of those facts and look at what the origins of this case was. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.